session. I can't make any promises, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be the first and last time we're really going to discuss it, at least the boogeyman, caricatured, satirical version of it. We just don't have time for that now or ever. What we are going to talk about is the other CRT, and that is culturally responsive teaching. Yeah, I see we have some fans in the crowd. Culturally responsive teaching has been shown through decades of research to be an extremely profoundly effective teaching strategy. Yet we're still asking very basic questions about it. We're still treating it as if it's a foreign or niche concept. So today I'm hoping we can sort of drill down into the more important questions, the hard questions. And I know the two women next to me are only here to discuss hard questions. You're not going to humor easy questions today. So before I do, I'll introduce myself. My name is Alia Wong. I cover education for USA Today, specifically inequities in education. And to my far right, to your far left, I have Zaretta Hammond. She is a national consultant. It looks like she needs no introduction, but for those of you who don't know her, she is the CEO of Transformative Learning Solutions and the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, Promoting Authentic Engagement and Rigor for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. And then right to my right, we have Tanji Reed Marshall. She is the director of P12 Practice, and she leads EdTrust's Equity in Motion assignment analysis work. So my first question is going to sound either very meta or very dumb, but I promise it isn't. And that question is, what is the real question we should be asking? We as in this crowd, we as in me, as you guys.
So I think the real question that we shouldn't be asking, how about we start there? So from this day forward, we are never going to ask ourselves, what is culturally responsive education? That's off your table, henceforth and forevermore. And the reason why we're not going to ask that question is because it's been answered, starting in the 70s. So if we're math people in the room, that's 40 years ago. So we're not going to answer that question anymore. We're going to talk about something different. We're going to ask ourselves, since this idea, this concept has been around for 40 years, why are we still asking ourselves what it is? And then why are we still asking ourselves why we can't do it? And so Zaretta and I have been really having a lot of conversations back and forth about the real question. And the real question here is, why aren't we doing it? What is it about a human being who comes into a classroom that a person who has chosen this profession cannot see as a human being simply because they are embodied in a vision that is other than themselves? That's the first question. So that's the kind of thing we've been going to be talking about for the rest of our time.
And I think what's also important is, why are we so easily confused between the CRT that is critical race theory and the CRT that is culturally responsive teaching? And I think that is to your point. If we are really understanding that the way we hold on to information, the way we process information, the way we learn is rooted in the interplay of culture and cognition, then we wouldn't be looking at culturally responsive teaching like it's a thing that I got to go get PD'd up on. You know, we're slapping it on everything, like gluten-free. That issue's on everything.
Yeah, it's the coconut water.
Right? And so the degree to which we are asking a different question, what do I need to be learning so that I can level up my understanding of how the brain learns and how I use the funds of knowledge that students come in with? Pushing ourselves past this idea of relationship. We talked about that a lot, right? Because you hear a lot of people just talk about relationships. But the fact is, just knowing and being friendly with a student is not enough. How are you going to be the personal trainer of that student's cognition? So we're not even asking questions about instruction.
Not yet.
We're caught up in the
sexiness of it all.
That's right. And we just keep repeating these words as if I keep repeating them, that's going to make me better understand how to help a student grow their brain power.
Yeah, and we keep leveling down to the most basic level to the most basic element of if I can at least do that one thing that looks like I'm responding to what I believe to be a child's culture, because let's be clear and honest, because we're all friends here, when we say race, when we say culture, we have a conflated understanding that it equals race, because the 80% of our teaching force happens to be white, and we're realizing that the large portion of our public school population are children of color. And so it is this misconception that if you are a person embodied in what we call a white person, you are devoid of culture. That is a falsehood. And so since you don't believe, or the sort of mystic thing around culture is that it equals race, we are now deciding to be culturally responsive or relevant means to do something racially ascribed to your teaching. And that's not how the brain is working.
That's right.
At all.
Another thing I see in education, to build on what you're saying in terms of what are the right questions we should be asking, it is centered around the difference between curriculum and instruction. We have gotten very enamored with decolonizing our curriculum, social justice this, social justice that. Yeah, and I'm being a little snarky about it because we've kind of like overdone it. And we still are only paying attention to strategies.
That's right.
And adding more brown faces to our books, but the children in front of you can't read. They don't have automaticity with number sense. We have forgotten the instruction piece. And when we look at what Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, what Dr. Asa Hilliard, others who paved the way before culturally responsive teaching became a buzzword that, you know, big businesses in education were capitalizing on, they were really talking about how do we have education for liberation? How are we really making sure that the kind of instruction we're giving students is not the pedagogy of compliance, but is actually allowing them to grow their brain power? Because a lot of stuff we like to actually think about, I'm honoring students' identity and I'm doing these things, and you walk in the classroom and they're over scaffolding.
Yeah.
The teacher's doing the work. Who is carrying the cognitive load in your classroom? That's the question.
That's the question. And the question is, if I am honoring their identity, but I am not teaching them how to do this thing that we call reading, where's the honor? What am I honoring? If I say I honor their identity, but I'm not giving them the support when needed and coming back when needed, what am I honoring? When I'm making decisions about who I'm going to call on because I think they might not have an answer, or who I will give wait time to because their brain is processing, how am I using my instructional power as a tool to thwart their building block of actual learning? That's maybe a question we should be asking as well.
So what you're really making me think about is, if you are actually doing culturally responsive teaching for the benefit of equity and liberatory education, you have to be taking an inquiry stance.
Yeah.
You actually have to start with questions about what kind of instruction. And a lot of times we just want to add new strategies versus asking deep questions and stepping back and actually looking at what's going on in your instructional core. Who's doing the talking? If you're doing the talking, whoever's doing the talking is doing the learning. And if the same kids are doing the talking, and the kids you're most worried about, the most vulnerable, the historically marginalized, don't have access, you just putting grade level text in front of you ain't gonna get it. All that's gonna do is invite you to continue to over scaffold.
Right. Yeah.
And it just becomes a crutch over time.
I call it strategies. We're into the mode of giving strategies over and over and over again because we don't, at the core of all of this is what you really believe. What do you really honestly believe? There's a question. What do you honestly believe about the embodiment of humanity sitting in front of you? If the embodiment of humanity looks like you, therefore you have positive beliefs about their ability, that's a question. But if that embodiment is different from you and it sort of blocks your ability to really get down into teaching, there's a question.
So this builds on where I see a lot of people getting stuck when they want to take up culturally responsive teaching. They lean into the relationships. So I hear a lot of people repeat that. It's about relationships. And in culturally responsive teaching in the brain, I break it down into rapport. This is building the human connection. right? But you have to move past that and leverage that into an alliance, meaning I am actually going to help you level up. I know it's going to get rocky, it's going to get tough when you go into the learning pit, when you are engaged in productive struggle, but I believe you can, and I am going to teach you the skills and tools and processes to do that. This is not, growth mindset, rah-rah. If I hear another person tell me about a growth mindset, like you can go over there and get that at CVS on aisle 3A.
That's right. That's right.
Right? Because, and then I have people who want to just tell kids about the brain. Let me just tell you about your brain. Well, I can't read. How about you tell me about how those long vowels work?
That's a thing.
Right? So this is the point that I want to keep getting to is how do we ask the questions about what's the quality of instruction we're giving to the most vulnerable kids, and how do we level up the quality of that instruction? Then you have to ask the question, who do you need to be to do that? Because you might need to learn a thing or two, and just learning about social justice is not going to cut it. Because that is not the problem.
Because it's not socially just. Right? So we're using language in this very sexy way.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is Johnny still leaves school not being able to read.
Yeah, read and as
right,
you were just
think.
going to say, learn how to learn. So this is even beyond critical thinking, right? We hear people say that. What we know is you have to improve information processing. You have to learn how to learn. The kids that we are not worried about, those that are advantaged, typically white, middle class, more affluent English speakers, what they have is the ability to get a library card and go teach themselves anything. That's because they have learn how to learn skills. I was on a panel recently with a South African professor, and he said in South Africa, because they've had similar issues trying to move past apartheid, which had created kind of 2- and 3-tiered education systems, and he says they are fighting for cognitive justice.
Yeah.
Because we have been doing cognitive redlining in our classrooms.
That's right, we have.
So the pedagogy of compliance means as long as you're just completing the assignment, I don't care what the quality, did you hit the standard? Don't really care. I'm going to check it off, or I'm going to over-scaffold to the point that you get through it. But when that child is by themselves with that test, or with the performance as they go out to get a job, or to apply to a prestigious program they want to be in, they will not be able to complete it on their own. That's your marker. Are you cognitively independent? Mm-hmm. And who do you need to be? Because just telling them about the brain is not going to make them cognitively independent.
No, it will not. And just being their friend and loving them, but your best love is your ability to get students to be independent learners.
Absolutely.
And independent thinkers.
That's a good segue to the next topic I want to get into. But before I do, just a reminder, you probably know the drill by now, but if not, go into your app and click on the session and click engage. If you have any questions, you can enter them at any time, and we'll try to get to them at the end of this conversation. So what I could do is ask you guys to list best practices, but I'm not, right?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
What I do want you guys to discuss is the relationship between best practices and responsive practices. What is that relationship?
That relationship, I think, is one that deals with how do you perceive what is best and how do you perceive what it means to respond. If something is best, that means you hold it as a static, unchanging thing. So if my best practice, I'm a swimmer. So is there a best practice as swimming, or as a triathlete, is there an absolute best practice to be that thing? No, there is not. But if I'm responding, that means I'm coming at it through a multiplicity of lenses and perspectives to help me understand how best to respond.
Yeah, let me build on that, because one of the things I see in education a lot is, even now as we talk about culturally responsive teaching, people used to want the checklist for working with African American children, right? It's like, don't ask me that.
Please don't.
Like,
no more.
Don't start, none won't be none.
Right.
And because that's the wrong attitude to approach it. Now we're doing that in a similar way when we start to say, what are the best practices around culturally responsive teaching? Two things are problematic about that. The very first one is a best practice is static. And what happens is we just employ that practice like it's a strategy, and we forget about the student. A best practice is antithetical to a responsive practice. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't design principles of culturally responsive instruction, but then those design principles I get to organize in a way that best meets the need of my student, individual student, small groups of students, and my whole class. But that's me understanding those design principles versus just give me the best practices that are fixed and I'm going to apply them or, put them on the student like this is, Harry Potter's, Wizarding World. I'm about to zap him. This is what we do. I did that culturally responsive thing. And like some magic is supposed to happen. Friends, don't let friends go down that road.
That's right. I love it. Yeah.
Right? You see your partner, you see your colleague, just do a little tap on the and just have a little conversation, because this is what gets us in trouble when we are in our professional learning communities, right? We start to, I've read the book, and next thing I know, we're strategy stripping. Let's do the thing. We want the actionable thing. Freire says the way we move toward liberatory education is through praxis. Conceptual understanding that drives informed action, that leads to critical analysis and reflection. You can't be doing no informed action if you don't know what the hell that's about. You're just repeating what someone told you to repeat, and you don't know if they are about liberatory education. So if you don't level up your understanding of those design principles, then you're going to fall into the best practice basket.
And I think falling into that best practice basket really comes out of a space of very shallow knowledge. Baseline knowledge, since if I read your book or I read Freire's book or I read any other book, I now think I know, but I don't have a deep enough set of knowledges to put into practice. I don't understand the function of the knowledge I have begun to acquire. Therefore, I don't know how to engage that to actually even produce what might be considered culture responsive, because my knowledge is limited and shallow. And so if we're going to be thinking about how to be responsive to those people in front of us who we have chosen to engage in this thing called teaching, because we don't live in the time of the giver, right? So since we don't, we've got to make sure that our knowledge is deep, our knowledge is broad, our knowledge is about ourselves and the student and the content. It's got to be a trifecta of knowledge so that we can then understand the relationship and the functionality of it as an engagement, so we can get to that outline, those outcomes that we want.
Absolutely. This is where the role of learning by doing is so important, because you're going to suck at something before you get better at it.
That's right.
Right? I call it the rule of the first pancake. Right? First pancake is
terrible,
crunchy and burnt on one side, runny and gooey on it. And ain't nobody shutting down the kitchen. Give it to the baby, the dog, the garbage. Somebody gonna get that pancake. And the cook is going to make adjustments, thin that out, heat up that griddle a little higher. And then the good pancakes are gonna start coming. And people are understanding. When we understand how change happens, we know we will take a dip. But if you have not created a true professional learning community where you are learning from that doing, and I'm not talking about let's just go out and get some more data. Street data, love the book, love the concept, no shame, but it's not enough to continue just to look at our data. What am I doing to improve the dialogic relationship with my students? Who's talking in the classroom? Is there time for students to talk? And I'm not talking about no weak-ass turn and talk.
Yeah, please.
Stop that.
Yeah.
Right? That's good for some things, but that's not good for deep learning. And yeah, you can repeat that. I'm sure this on video. I said it. Because here's the thing about it. Students who need to accelerate their learning need that opportunity, and those are the students who don't believe in themselves. Competence precedes confidence. We want to give the growth mindset, oh, you could do it, you could do it. The student says, I can't. I know I can't. The warm demander helps the student. The active demanding part, not none of that warm strict. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name no names. Friends don't let friends repeat
Bad
things that are just not effective.
Yeah.
The strict part is not strict. That original research said active demandingness, which meant I am your coach and I will help you level up. And I'm actually going to coach you to do that. So that's the alliance part of that partnership. You, me, together, we're going to do something. Instructional conversation. That's the formative feedback. Where are there feedback loops in your classrooms? And here's the thing I will say about this. None of this is the sexy talk about race or social justice.
It is not.
But this is the path to social justice. Making sure every child leaves your care a powerful learner.
That's right. Because that's what a socially just education is. We can talk about social justice, but if we are not engaging in the actual practices of intellectual development, we're not having a socially just educational environment. And that's that connection between,
that's right.
What's my knowledge? Do I know? Do I have the understanding of the functionality? How does what I know operate so that I can then engage it, so we can then produce independent learners, learners who are able to actually think for themselves and challenge their own thinking. You talked about this idea of students with their growth mindset. And as long as I preach to you, you can. Students know when you're pulling their leg. And I'm just going to say pulling their leg, because now you know how old I am, right? So, but I'll say another word later. But they know when you're doing that thing to them.
Yeah.
And merely saying you can does not produce growth.
This is why I love the work of Agency by Design. You know, Project Zero does Agency by Design, but Agency by Design Oakland, they service predominantly Latinx, African American families in West Oakland, in East Oakland. And what they're doing is actually helping them improve their information processing. But they're doing that not by, I'm going to teach you these skills. It's not a technical thing. They're doing it by leveraging students' agency, intellectual curiosity. So during the pandemic, they were one of the few where they created Spark Kits, where kids took them home and they started to do inquiry around their house, in their community, right? So they had science kits, they had lit kits, go find the history in your community, do some digging. So all the skills we wanted kids to use, they had prepared them to use them in their own environment. What the pandemic showed is that we have been underdeveloping students' cognitive capacity, and we have been promoting a pedagogy of compliance, and now everybody's up in arms that kids have unfinished learning. That is by design. We did that. Families didn't do that. So what will we do to rectify it? So this is the social justice element of that, right? Being able to understand, where do we start? You have to start small. We can't start with everything, right? Agency by Design Oakland started with these Spark Kits, letting kids know that, hey, you can do it, and it's going to be messy. So we can't be grading it. It's not about grades and points. This is about, have you learned to carry more of the cognitive load? Let me see your growth as a learner.
It's your knowledge building. Yeah. It really is your knowledge building. And when you think about agency, and that's going to be the next big set of words coming out all over the place because it's everywhere already, making sure what you know about agency. How does agency function? How do you engage agency? And what is it meant to produce from children?
Right.
And really, as the adult, agency is a two-piece process. The adult has to be ready for when children practice their agency on them, because they will.
That's right.
And you will be pushing back if you're not ready for the way in which you develop agency, because agency is a tool by which children begin to make decisions on their own behalf.
Yeah.
And what we're calling agency in the classroom is managed choice.
Ooh.
That is not agency. It's the choice you get from the list I give you, like dinner, hot dog, hamburger. That's not agency. Agency was what my son did when I said hot dog, hamburger. He said nothing. I was like, okay, well, hungry then. But, but you know, those are the ideas that we're beginning to hear again. It's this idea of agency and letting kids just choose. It must be developed. And you must really understand the knowledge pieces of it. You really must understand you as the adult and your response to it when it begins to show up.
I love this whole point about we have to be ready when they start to flex their learning muscles, right? And this is the coach. You're going to have to channel your Mr. Miyagi,
Yeah, that's
right?
right.
Wax on, wax
Exactly.
off.
That's
I
right.
want to learn karate. Little do they know you're hiding the vegetables all around them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't understand how you have to let the student struggle, I don't mean just fall flat on your face, but productive struggle, that they are stepping back and like, oh snap, I know how to do that now. This is where the feedback loops come in. But what's really important about what you said is, we can have something like agency, but if you approach any of these buzzwords, new phrases, concepts with a deficit mindset, then you're going to blame the victim.
That's right.
Then you're going to say, take agency, but you've never developed that capacity. When the student actually says, no, I don't want to do that,
That's
you
right.
say, oh, you're being defiant, out.
Out, that's right. Absolutely will happen.
So now we're in a power struggle, particularly when students get to high school and they're mad about the fact that you have undereducated them and you want them to kind of get with the program and they're giving you attitude. You created that. So how will you repair that? We need a culture of repair. It's one of the themes right now that Agency by Design Oakland is really leaning into, right? What does it look like to live in an age of repair? Mm-hmm. Not only just our cell phones, we just throw it away, go get another one, but to really even think about the human relationships. So using that as a theme, where do we repair? When we start to think about cognitive justice, what needs repairing there? So culturally responsive teaching is not just a thing. It's about repair. Think about culture responsive teaching as the path to getting to that liberatory education. Think about it as cognitive reparations. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
We have undereducated groups of people for hundreds of years based on their race, their language, their ethnicity, the level of melanin in their skin. What reparations cognitively are we giving them so that we build their capacity to be more powerful learners? Not just because we say it or pronounce it. You pronounce, we're doing productive struggle. That don't make it so.
No, it does not. And one piece on what you just said, what I found very interesting, is this idea that because I say it, I make it so, or repairing. If I'm talking about agency and I have not built an understanding about what it is, and a child begins to show it, my instructional power is going to take over. And it's going to do something very nasty to children because I'm going to feel a certain amount of authoritarian threat, and I'm going to respond out of that space. And that's going to be really important not to really deeply understand what you're looking for and what you're trying to produce when you're getting kids to be more agentic in their understanding and in the way that they approach their education. Because at the end of the day, whatever grade you're teaching at the moment, that means a child has come to you from someplace, they're going through you on their way someplace else. And so you have to be understanding of where you are in their stream of knowledge building, in their stream of becoming an independent, critically minded human.
Here's what I would add to that. You have to be mindful also of their unfinished learning from the previous grades.
Yes, absolutely.
Because learning is cumulative. Mm-hmm. So I have a student, I'm going to teach grade level material in the 6th grade. They come to me with unfinished learning from the 5th grade. Now they don't make standard in the 6th grade. I'm going to send them to 7th grade. They only get grade level materials. And underneath that is 5th and 6th grade unfinished learning gaps. So we are actually producing these achievement gaps, right? Learning gaps turn into opportunity gaps, turn into achievement gaps. So for us to talk about the achievement gap, the only way we can close achievement gaps are by closing learning gaps. Only way we can close learning gaps are by empowering students to be powerful learners so that they can accelerate their own learning. Mm-hmm. We do not have enough clock hours in the school day to remediate all that. You have to have the student in partnership where you have set it up where they can learn things inside and outside of school to close those gaps. You have to stimulate intellectual curiosity where they want to lean into closing those, and that you have to create a culture of error so that they are not afraid of making mistakes. Yeah. The pedagogy of compliance, this is how we kept enslaved folks in check. I want to make you scared about what might happen if you don't. You're going to lose some points, or you're not going to, you've got to be able to help students just engage in the learning. So culturally responsive teaching is really encompassing this idea that you just laid out about what agency actually looks like, and how this is not you just stepping back and letting them do. This is what we learned from Montessori. This is what we can learn from Waldorf. There are other methods of learning that actually empower children. And quite as it's kept, Montessori was designed for students who had been historically marginalized.
That's right.
And cognitively
impaired,
underdeveloped. This was the whole point. So all that research, all those skills, all that know-how of how to do that has already been out there. And that's what I've been trying to do in culturally responsive teaching. I'm not making anything new up. I'm trying to bring to you not just what the research, what the practices have been for decades, that somehow we just want to have amnesia about.
And I think we want to have amnesia about what has been going on in education because it suits our underlying purposes. So if we understand the history of education, education's always been leveled. We have always had a decision in this country about which group of people gets educated to assume which role in society. What's been happening now is such a critical shift in jobs, in roles, that now we have, and the system who was originally designed to serve is no longer serving. And so since the system was designed to serve mainly white children, that we are now realizing they are not being served, now we're trying to shift gears. So we need to go ahead and call a spade and lay that out there and be truthful about it. But now that we're doing that, we're realizing the wholesale undereducation of all groups. And it come to the forefront through testing. We talked about that earlier today in our own private time. We talked about what we learned through testing. But the point here is, if you are about being responsive to the humans in front of you, regardless, and I don't want to say regardless, in whatever encasement they come to you as, then you are responsible to really getting to know yourself, where you sit in your own understanding of what their embodiment represents, and then how you will handle that when it comes time to get them to do what we've been talking about here.
Absolutely. I think that's a good segue.
Yeah. Let's talk about instructional leadership, right? That's the way we bridge these gaps. That's the way we get past this amnesia. So let's talk about that.
I think that in this last statement really made me continue to think about the role of leaders. And I don't mean just the admin, principal, I mean, everybody is leading. You're leading from your classroom, right? You're showing the way through inquiry. Let me share with you what I learned about moving this group of students from dependent learning to cognitively independent learning. So as we start to better understand how we do that, we can get together with other colleagues and we compare notes, we do inquiry, we learn by doing, we videotape, we look at that videotape. And we're not trading in strategies. We're trading in the coaching and development of students, so that instructional leadership has to be about that. How are we improving the instructional core? Not let's have another training on implicit bias or say we're being anti-racist. Is that important? Yes. But don't think that just because you're saying you're being anti-racist, that's going to change or close those learning gaps for students. That is a start. It puts you in the right mind frame, but it is not giving you the skills that you need to actually do that. So I think instructional leadership, number one, has to be about how are we making sure we are building students' capacity in the classroom to be powerful learners. What are the conditions? What are the structures? What are the routines? And this is not, I'm not talking about, oh, we have morning meeting where we check in. If your SEL takes place 15 minutes at the top of the day and y'all ain't checked in again, you're not doing the kind of emotional support that goes with cognition. Because when I start to stretch into my ZPD, I will get scared if I am a dependent learner. How have you prepared that student to reframe how they approach errors and making mistakes? And if you haven't recultured your classroom around that, that's part of what it means to be culturally responsive. But a lot of people are stuck in, I'm talking about race, I'm talking about inequity, I'm talking about civil rights. Listen, the history of black and brown people did not start with slavery.
Thank you.
It did not start with colonization.
Thank you.
So let us not repeat that. That's part of the challenge we have. Look at the books you're bringing in. If we're not talking about basketball, we're talking about civil rights or who was on what bus. There are other things, and now everybody wants to be a genius. Yeah, we can have genius, but you got to cultivate someone's capacity. And so leaders have to look at, what does our pacing guide look like? Because if I tell you, yeah, go cultivate geniuses, and that pacing guide says, keep it moving, those two things are at odds.
And I think as a leader, your teachers can do in their classrooms what you model in your building. So if you are modeling the kinds of reflexive and reflective practices with your classroom leaders, your teachers, then they will be more willing to do that in the classroom with their students. If you as the leader are saying, you know what, go in there and do a new lesson and don't worry about the outcome because I know about the first pancake rule. And so you're going to be okay. Go ahead and do that. Once you pull back and put into practice the kind of instructional strategies or practices that you want your teachers to do, then they'll do it because you will have been that model. So instructional leadership really is about what you are doing to let your teachers know what you expect. Because it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what you do.
That's right.
So you can say anti-racism all day and twice on Sunday for good measure, but if your students are still walking out of the building and they're not independent thinkers, and they're not straight, and they're not strong writers, and they're not able to engage in deep thought and critical thinking, you're not being anti-racist. You're not doing that. If you as a leader are punitive in your actions when teachers don't follow the quote-unquote pacing guide, that's not being responsive. So if you want responsiveness as a leader, then you have to come at this with your own sets of knowledge. How does your knowledge function? What are the engagement elements of your knowledge? How does it produce what you want out of teachers to get it out of kids? So it's really this continuous cycle of understanding what learning is all about, how to improve learning, how to use data, wide data, short data, street data, quant data, qual data.
All the data.
All the data that you can name.
That's right.
The thing here is, what are we advancing?
That's right. And I think what's so important about what you're saying is, it's not just enough to have data and look at the data. It's what is the data going to prompt us to change?
Right.
And what's our appetite for change? Right? And this is why I find a lot of people get stuck. And then this is why it becomes just about the strategy and not about the kids, because that stuff is messy. Moving students to do things that they've now got habituated to doing. Like if you're carrying me everywhere and then you put me down and say walk, why would I want to walk?
Yeah.
You've been carrying me.
Yeah.
You've been doing all the cognitive work. If I just sit here and wait, you're going to jump in again because you don't like silence. You think I'm struggling. You don't want me to fail. I don't want your self-esteem hurt. The list keeps going as to why we jump in. And we're not saying just leave kids on their own. We're saying coach them through a gradual release of responsibility that allows them to build these muscles. And when they fall, when they get stuck, that's the coaching moment. The opportunity for you to have space in your classroom for conferring and to have instructional conversation, not a IEP meeting.
Yeah.
We're not doing goals, but you're doing what got you stuck.
Yeah.
Asking them to be metacognitive and metastrategic about what do you think you might want to do. Okay, so the next 3 weeks you're going to try what? All right, come back and tell me how that let's next time we get together. Right? This is a way of helping them think about their thinking. This goes back to agency. Mm-hmm. But if that's not what you as an instructional leader is trying to make sure happens in your school, it's not going to happen.
It isn't.
Right? That idea is not going to by itself just start to take hold. No. It's going to be something that has to be nurtured.
Because if you're the leader and you have in your mind the way your building is going to run and it does not involve the actions of agentic work from a teacher side and a student side, it won't happen. It will always be squashed. It will always be pushed aside. We have a question here. It says, can you explain more on the concept of cognitive redlining and what you see this as in a classroom environment? Well, redlining, raise your hand if you know what redlining is sort of holistically, right? So we know what redlining is, what banks did in neighborhoods.
That's right, housing.
Housing, to keep certain people in certain groups, mainly to let realtors know where to steer Black people and where to allow banks to finance homes after the GI Bill came out. So if you take that concept and apply it to a classroom environment, cognitive redlining is when you are deciding who is going to get the advantage of learning in your classroom. Where will those fault lines come out? At a class once, we did some work in Rhode Island, and there's a gentleman in an honors class. He actually said, he actually called it, we have cognitive, he didn't call it redlining, he said stereotyping. We have cognitive stereotyping in our school, and I know my friends are a victim of it. Because he was in an honors class and he understood what that means. So in a class, that's what it'll look like. How would you say it?
I would say that very similar, understanding and remembering the experience of housing. This is what Jenny Oakes talked about. This is not a new concept. This is what Dr. Ladson Billings talked about when she talks about the education debt. Mm-hmm. The challenge is we don't bring that into the instructional core, right? Dr. Richard Elmore talked about the idea of the instructional core. Teacher, the student, the content, always in a dynamic dance. Change one, you have to change the other two. And this is what I talk about as that pedagogy of compliance. Some kids you've got to stay compliant, look at me, lean in, slant, hand signals, whatever it is. Those are control mechanisms. That's character building. So when we start to talk about redlining, those are the kids who don't get kind of the watered up curriculum. They get the fill-in sheets, or they get the over-scaffolding, an activity that is that highly controlled. Well, it looks like they're doing something, but I'm telling you where to go, how to do that. And as a result, cognition doesn't actually develop. What we know from the science of learning is you must have productive struggle. You have to have two powerful, complex things that you're rubbing together. So when you think of rigor, rigor has two axes. One is complexity, two or more complex things that you're trying to see the pattern of, the relationship, cause and effect. There are a variety of things that our brain processes. That's the complexity. But it also has to have student autonomy. So for something to actually be rigorous that students can engage in, it has to be designed with these two elements. If the student can't do it, if there's no autonomy, you over-scaffolding doesn't make it rigorous. So if those students don't have rigorous things, then they don't grow dendrites. When you grow dendrites, those dendrites start to fold onto themselves and become neural pathways. When those neural pathways are visited back and forth, they become myelinated. When we have myelination, we can think faster at a higher level. So you cannot get to that kind of, we're going to teach critical thinking in a low-level way. It's not possible. But go in and sit in some of the classes, shadow a student, and you'll see the low-level work. I'm not trying to call nobody out. This is just our system. Right? Who is doing the talking? It's overly scripted toward control of thinking. There's no opportunity for messiness. The teacher doesn't know how to control messiness. Therefore, there's no opportunity for productive struggle. Productive struggle is not because I said we are now going to engage in productive struggle.
That doesn't happen that way, yeah.
Said no one ever.
Said no one ever. Friends don't let friends say or do that.
Oh, there's some questions popping up.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll read another one of the questions from the audience, if that's okay. What is your advice for teachers being told to stick to scripted curriculum and teach the test when those teachers know it doesn't benefit children?
That's a good one and a sticky one.
Well, listen, I got no problem answering that.
Yeah,
Close your damn door and do the damn thing.
Yeah, there's that. But also remember this.
Okay, I'm going to stop. How many times is your principal really coming in your room?
That's right. Let's be clear about that.
How many? Come on now.
Yeah.
How long does it take you to really teach long vowels or teach that math concept or do that thing we acting like the principal's in there every 10 minutes. And the reality is we have so much more autonomy than we are claiming for ourselves as educators.
That's right.
Claim what you already have. So the scripted curriculum, water that ish up. All right, don't get me worked up.
No, don't do that.
I have to take a blood pressure pill.
That's right. But I think, too, though, and I think I agree with you, but the nuance is this. If what you are leveling up to or taking out of or making an adjustment for is not going to prepare the student to do what is expected of them, don't do that.
Yeah.
You do have a responsibility to your children to make sure that they are prepared. That is part of your job. There is absolutely no profession that you go into where a test is not going to happen. If you go to law school, you're taking a test. You go to medical school, you're taking a test. You can't get your driver's license.
Yeah.
But you have to, so you do have more autonomy, and you're absolutely right. You've got more autonomy than you think. But what's been happening, though, is when people are walking away from their curricula, they're doing things that are not as beneficial as they think they are. That's not any of you.
That's right.
That's not any of you in this room. However, there are certain sites people go to. There are certain places where people go. And those places and those sites are not doing what is best for students, even though maybe the scripted one is overly scripted. So be careful,
Yeah.
be judicious, be careful, do what you know is right for your students, but really think about the cognitive load. Think about your knowledge, the function, the engagement, and the production.
I think this is really spot on. And here's what I would say. Change one small thing around the instruction.
Yeah.
Right? The curriculum is the content.
Yeah.
But, I wrote an article, April 2020, in Ed Leadership, The Power of Protocols for Equity. Right? Can you just start putting some talk in there, some powerful discussion protocols, right? What's one small change you can make that actually teaches students how to learn at higher levels? You don't have to change the curriculum. What we're talking about is how do you give kids new school tools? You don't have to change the curriculum to actually talk about a culture of error. What do we do when we get confused? Here's a way of reframing that. That doesn't have to mean you have to ditch that. Here's the thing I will say about tests. We do have to take tests, and we want to prepare students to be independently capable of actually, demonstrating the knowledge. But the way we do that is not to teach for the test.
No.
The way we do that is to develop their ability to process information.
That's right.
And build that background knowledge. This is what white parents are doing. This is what affluent parents are doing. The reason their kids get high test scores isn't because somebody's teaching to the test. It's because the students have learned how to learn. They're getting the college tutor. They're going to Kumon. Sylvan is getting them.
That's right.
That idea that there's an opportunity for the student to kind of get coached into higher levels of learning, not just kind of mind dumped in the information. So figure out where you're going to hide your vegetables for that scripted program, right? I'm not talking about ditch it and roll up on your principal, because I don't have a job for you.
That's right. Hello. Neither does. Yeah.
But I am saying, think about teaching is still a subversive act, particularly teaching for liberation. What small thing can you do that is not, I don't have to roll up on anybody to do it, but this is going to empower the student. The student will start to think differently, student will start to do differently in a way that gives them agency, which takes us to that other question. How do design principles help in the development of agency? Well, I don't know. It depends on what design principles you're talking about and the kind of agency you're talking about. For student agency, I think being able to understand how the brain learns and the social emotional components of cognition. So when we understand that we will all get confused when we learn, that's how everybody learns. Oh, I don't understand this. I'm confused. Ooh, now how do I feel about that? Either I'm going to get my amygdala hijacked and say, I can't do it and I'm going to give up. Or the classroom has been designed to allow you to actually move through that confusion and actually lean into it and say, I can learn something from these mistakes I'm making, just like engineers do.
Yeah.
Oh, that didn't work.
That's
Let's
right.
go
Let's try
back and see
something
what
else.
happened.
That's right. And I think here this idea of design principles, that premise is that there are just a set of them. That there is one set of design principles, that if I do that set, if I enact those principles, then students will be more agentive in their actions. You want to be able to understand what type, like Zaretta said, what are you building? What are you moving towards? And what is a student's readiness for that? It's a mistake to think that you're going to take a baby who's 3 months old, put them on the floor, and tell them to walk and expect them to do that. And we're so into these new, well, we want student agency and student voice and student center and student everything. But if a child does not understand what that means, you will set that child up for overly being disciplined. You will set that child up for being put out of classes. You will set that child up for actions that won't benefit them. So if we're thinking about how to develop agency, students have to know what it is. What are we talking about?
Right.
Bring them into the conversation about what it is and why they need to, and they have it. They have it. You watch any 3-year-old and you know they have it, right? But, thinking about that from a school setting is very different. And we have to understand that we have to teach students, what does the word mean? What are you doing when you do those actions that are agentive? And guess what? There might be consequences that may not be favorable. And then here's how you handle those.
So one of the design principles is feedback loops.
There's one, yeah.
Right? I get better when I get feedback on my performance, not a grade, not a good job, but I actually have timely corrective feedback, and it's provided in a wise way, right? I talk about this idea of wise feedback. Affirming, I know you can do it, because the narrative of racial difference around low intelligence of people of color is predominant in education, right? There are 3 Brian Stevenson talks about, right? The lack of motivation for betterment, the assumption of criminality, and the assignment of intelligence, with melanated people having the lowest intelligence. And so these are 3 narratives. There are about 12 generally that operate in society, but those 3 permeate education. So now we approach students in that way. Assumption that behavior, even if that behavior for a white student just gets, hey, calm down, control yourself. For a black student, it gets overcorrected. Oh, you need to go out, we need to clamp down again, that control mechanism. So the design principle around feedback, managing and regulating oneself when you're moving through confusion, and how are you coaching students to do that? If you don't use the first 6 weeks of class to do that and establish not only a set of behavior or character norms, but social cognitive norms. And this ain't ask 3 before me. That's not what I'm talking about. This is the thing that you hear in Making Thinking Visible and some other places where we start to talk about what that agency looks like. But that takes time to cultivate and initiate students into that. We keep wanting this to be instant. We keep wanting culturally responsive teaching to be kind of a package thing. We're bringing in, it's going to be like a pop-up tent. I'm going to do it, and we're going to have the thing in the classroom. It's not that. It is work to cultivate this kind of approach that is liberatory, because you are pushing against a system that is a beast. It has been designed to sort and actually lay down that cognitive red line.
It has, yeah. And I think also, when you're thinking about your classrooms and your building, so if you're a leader in here, this idea of agency starts with how you approach your educators. Are your educators getting the kinds of feedback? Are they having conversations with you around agency and empowerment? Are you really, as a leader, making that pathway clear for your teachers so that they can then make the path clear for students? As we said earlier, your students can do what teachers can do. And if you're not allowing your teachers to do that, they will not do it consistently with your students in your buildings, in your districts, in your state. And so we really have to think about how we're going about this whole process. And adults have got to be clear about your stance on your own agency ideas. Where do you stand? What do you think a student really should be able to do? Do you sit inside the, in locos parentes perspective still? That you stand instead of a parent? Is that where you are? Do you really still believe you are the center of knowledge in your school, in your classroom? You must be clear about that.
Yeah.
Because if you begin to enact a behavior set that you really do not believe, it will have adverse effects on you and your students.
Yeah.
Because you'll be speaking one thing, your students will believe you, and then you'll do something opposite, which will cause hypocrisy in your classroom, and then the
they'll
relationship's
stop believing.
gone.
That's right. That's how you build
That's
trust.
how you build
Competency
trust.
is a trust builder.
Yeah.
Here's another question. When you consider gaps present before kinder, and I assume that means kindergarten, what does it mean for teaching, knowing that competence precedes confidence? Students learn to compare early. Well, they learn what we teach them.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that we believe that a kindergartner has a gap, but I really want to push back on that, that a student comes to school with a gap. First of all, isn't school a place where we learn things? Am I in that by myself? If I raise my hand? Who's the people that believe you go to school to learn things, right? So if a child is 5 years old and they get to kindergarten and they don't know the letter A, do they have a gap? Is that the gap? Don't they need to learn the letter A? Shouldn't they be taught the letter A as opposed to it being seen as a gap?
Yeah, here's the thing that I like to
keep
think
wondering
about
about
it,
that.
right? So the idea is that children start in a variety of places.
Yeah.
Part of what they do in school is we're giving them the tools and cultivating them so that they can actually develop the dispositions and skills and processes. Think about it as boot camp, right? When people join the military, they're going to go through boot camp. They come from all walks of life. All you got to do is watch that old movie, Officer and a Gentleman,
Yeah.
right? You got the biker
Yeah.
guy, the surfer chick, all walks of life. But they go through this training that gives them these tools, these processes, this way of thinking, this camaraderie that allows them to have a shared language, a shared skill set. So this is what we talk about when we're saying learning how to learn. Doesn't matter where they come and how they come into school. Our job is to be that equalizer. That every child will learn the same set. So why are you worried about those gaps? For some children, if they are not reading at home, doesn't mean that they don't have
Capable of reading.
capacity.
That's right. They're not reading at home.
Absolutely. But it just means, okay, I'm going to help cultivate this. This is the idea that we're not one-size-fits-all people.
And the idea that a child comes to school with a gap presupposes that all learning is school learning. And all learning is centered around a particular type of learning. And if we learned nothing while schools were in hybrid or, out of session, out of the building, students learn all the time, every day. So the idea that I have a gap when I'm in kindergarten means that I've done nothing from zero to the time I got there. And so that is categorically false because students are learning all the time. And so we have to really begin to rethink our knowledge and our understanding about what it means when a child enters school.
So I want to use that. We've got about a minute left to actually think about what is your personal definition of culturally relevant teaching. My personal definition really brings together this idea of the science of learning, what we understand about cognitive science and what we understand about the process of developing community capacity, right? That cultural capital in terms of distributed knowledge, distributed expertise, leveraging on legacy and history, the idea that there's stored funds of knowledge. These things aren't incompatible, and they can't be reduced to lessons, right? Or here's a content I'm gonna sprinkle in. It's how do we ask students to leverage that so that they are growing their schema? So I really think about the relevance being cognitive hooks so that students are growing in their power because they're deepening their background knowledge and developing these learn how to learn skills.
I think my personal definition of culturally relevant teaching centers around knowledge. What do you know about you? What do you know about your students? What do you know about your discipline? And how are you taking all of that sort of trifecta of knowledge, right? Your knowledge of the science of learning, your knowledge of the science of reading. How are you taking all of those knowledge sets and bringing them together so that when the child who is in front of you in their embodiment, whether it looks like yours or it does not look like yours, you are showing extreme value, radical value to their humanity, and you are engaging in this thing called teaching that leads to a person able to enter the world in any way they want.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Let's hear it for Zaretta and Tanji.